All right, so here we go. So thanks to everyone. Thanks to Ken, who I've had the pleasure of working with for the second time this week. And I've witnessed him be a great MC, and I'll be calling on him for a bit more of that today. And thanks to Steve Simpson, who I just met with the other day, Beverly Brown. And I know that there are many, many other folks that got together to create a more longer, enduring, appropriate commemoration of Dr. King. So thanks to all of you. And again, I know there are many, 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 many other folks that helped bring this together, and I don't know the half of it. So thanks for your work, and thanks for allowing me to be here today. Um, so as much as an honor and a privilege and an obligation as it is to be asked to share with you today, I was very unsure about what I wanted to share or try to contribute to this week's celebration. Um, Something that helped, I meditated on Beverly Brown's call for these proceedings, and it kind of helped tie together several loose thoughts that had been swimming around in my mind. So I wanted to acknowledge her and thank her for that, and actually share some of those words. So part of her call was the universe is telling us to dramatically change the narrative when it comes to seeking justice, creating equity, and dismantling systems that have historically marginalized our fellow citizens of color. Uh, there are parts of that narrative that are being lost daily, each day removed from when Dr. King was taken from us. I'm hoping today that we might all commit to taking back some of that narrative, to rediscovering some of that narrative, and to restoring Dr. King's narrative. And in so doing, allow his narrative to restore us in our efforts to live up to and live out his legacy. So, in that vein, in today's presentation, sorry, gotta scroll down. I'll be drawing heavily from Dr. King's last full-length book, Where Do We Go From Here? From Chaos to Community, which is this guy here, as well as, oh, there we go, thank you, as well as an interview Dr. King did with NBC Nightly News in 1967, which has been making the rounds on YouTube for a couple years now, and unbelievably enough, has not made any of the trending lists. So I was late to that game as well, but not late enough, because again, it seems if view counts mean anything, not enough folks have seen this restored video. So hopefully that'll change after today. If you haven't seen it, you'll be inspired to go check it out. And again, get the words from the man himself. We can't really do justice to what he gave to us. Ken, I have my first request of you, I guess, or just something I'm curious about to see in the chat, if we can do like a quick poll. And I need to bring you back because I lost you.
I'm here for you. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I was just curious, amongst the folks who are out there, if we have like a show of hands of who has this book. This book. Let's see.
And I see some chat coming through here.
All right, so first, all right, good. I got you back. I needed to have you there. So that's cool. All right. And yeah, I don't know if I'll see this in the chat, but yeah, if people can raise a hand, or let me see, how would I be able to see that?
I'm seeing a 1, but I'm seeing a lot of no's, and I do not. And
I see me, nor do I. Who's the author? I don't have it. Cool. All right, so this is my Oprah moment right now. To any students out there that do not have this book, and the it's written by Dr. King, and it is called Where Do We Go From Here? Where do we go from here? Chaos or Community? This edition has a introduction by Vincent Harding, who was a preeminent African-American historian, a close friend of Dr. King's, fellow activist and organizer, worked with him on much of the writing, did the first draft of the 1967 speech, Breaking the Silence, or Time to Break the Silence, about Vietnam. So, excellent edition. We'll get that out there to you. But my offer is this, and sorry, because I see some of my colleagues. If you're a student in the audience today, I won't verify that, some certain number of students that do not have this text and would like it, we will find a way to go through an independent bookstore and get you a copy of the book, because it's important, especially today. It takes a lot of mental fortitude and spiritual fortitude to kind of hang in there and know you're not crazy and keep fighting this fight. And this will make that very clear for you. Okay, no matter what else is going on or how crazy you're being led to believe you are, or how infuriated you might get. It is settling and it's inspiring and it's necessary. And if everybody read this, I wouldn't. You could read this in high school. I wouldn't have a job. It wouldn't need me, and I'd be okay with that. All right, so we'll make that happen. So Ken, now we can monitor and kind of find out who that is. Or people, please text. There are editions in the library.
Well, here's what we can do too is I'll put my email in the chat. And if you're a student, send me an email from your OCC student. I'll get that list compiled and Dr. Defreece and I will work together to get that to happen. I can say too, I'm seeing that we've got 2 copies in our local library. So at the college library, there's 2 copies if you're looking to check that out. So I'll put my email address in the chat so everyone's got it. And if you're a student, send me an email, say I'm in this event. I'd love to get the copy.
Awesome. Thank you, Ken.
My pleasure.
All right. And I apologize. It was there. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? That is the title. Okay. So before we turn to that, and again, spend a little bit of time on that restored interview footage from NBC. I did want to kind of do a little check out there in the audience again, if you could indulge me and perhaps put some responses into the chat. Now, I know you will be tempted to give essay length answers to this, but I'm going to try to ask people to restrain themselves to a word or two or a phrase or two. And I've got 2 questions I want to ask. So my first question, again, we're thinking about narratives and kind of our collective understanding of it. What was Dr. King fighting for? I understand that's an unfair question. There's lots written on it, but hopefully a short phrase or 2 phrases if people feel like kind of throwing something in there. Again, to get a collective sense of what we think that narrative is about. Thank you. I see lots of stuff coming in, and again, I appreciate it. This work that he calls on us to do, he had a heck of a team, and he knows that, and historians have laid that out. And so it's always about all of us pulling our knowledge together and kind of moving forward. So, all right. So Ken, I'll go ahead and read some in because I am able to see it here, and we got some stuff coming in. I see equality, equity and justice, equal rights, right? And much has been said about, equality versus equity and racial justice, equality, equal rights for all, racial justice and equity. Let's see. Oh, hey Ken, I'm gonna get this one on to you. Darlene is requesting if you could type the type the question into the chat for the panelists.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you so much, sir. Racial equality and economic justice, justice and equality, equality for the underserved, labor rights, awareness. Thank you, Shay. Racial ethnic equality and the betterment of the lives of the poor. Y'all killing it, and kept it short, and I appreciate that. Common humanity, the realization of America's promise, unity, anti-capitalism, anti-militarism, racial and economic equity. Hey, Michelle. All right. To put into practice, all men, women are created equal. Thank you all so much. Yep, there we go. All right. I have a shorter answer, and I don't think it's at odds at all. but it's shorter for me, and so I can put it in my pocket and take it out as I need to. My answer would be an end to white supremacy. So we'll think about how that squares, and with some of what was shared. And again, that's the idea, right? We share, we figure it out, we go forward. I have another question. So this time, Ken, I guess we'll have you be ready to type it in the chat. What was Dr. King fighting against? So same thing. If people, indifference, absolutely. Institutional racism, amen. Systemic racism in power, systemic racism, racism and social injustice, complacency, injustice, the systems and institutions of racial oppression, white complacence. So here's the thing. The great news in reference to his narrative is that it's not foreign to everyone. And what originally came to my mind in thinking through this call around narrative was how often we see that narrative being corrupted, maligned, misrepresented, and used for other people's political purposes. It means a lot that within our institution, within this community, we have some clear, albeit, things we could discuss, certainly. But we seem to be on the right track, and that makes a difference. There's no way to combat the floodgates of misinformation other than people having an actual accurate, true representation of what King was talking about, and then having some basis on, reasons that we know that that's what he was talking about, right? White supremacy, withheld rights, inhumanity, white supremacy, silence, institutional racism, and people had no hope for change, oppression of people of color, right? All right, so thank you all. And guess what? My other answer for that also is white supremacy, right? As I understand, King was fighting, again, it's a shorthand, right, to capture a lot of what was stated here, and in some cases it aligns perfectly well. But King was fighting for an end to white supremacy and fighting against white supremacy in its many, many forms. All right, so one thing I wanted to point out, there is, well, I'll put it up here. So when doing a little bit of research for this, we often, we hear about, and I apologize, I shouldn't have put this up there. So it's pretty commonplace to talk about, the radical king near the end of his life. And this is true, right? I guess perhaps his radical message became clearer or more pronounced, perhaps, or at least that's how it struck people. Though in reality, early on King, young King, had a lot of those same sentiments, right? So we don't want to always attribute his radicalization to the idea that, well, he tried some stuff in the civil rights movement and saw it didn't work out and then decided he needed to do something a little bit stronger. He knew very early on, and this is present in a lot of his earlier writings, that white supremacy was, and that it wasn't limited to what they would fight against during the civil rights movement. He understood that to be a small piece. He couldn't know until some of the legislative victories had been won what the limitations of those victories would be. But in any case, the scariness of the term white supremacy, he was quite comfortable with it. So there was a speech that he gave, and now I'll kind of put up the description of it. So it's a typed manuscript prepared as a radio sermon and later used at Dexter. King elaborates upon Harry Emerson Fosdick's sermon, Righteousness First. King comments on domestic and international affairs, including American race relations and the recent conflict in Korea. So this was in 1953, I want to say. Hope I got that right. I believe it was 1953. In any case, this is way before discussions of Vietnam, and way before what some of us have become familiar with in terms of his speaking out against militarism, capitalism, and so on and so forth, right? This is a young King. And we're going to do some of this read-in style today, again, because King's words are the best. So just briefly, and again, Google on these things and they'll It'll pop up for you. So this mystery called life is so constructed that there are certain material goods that man has to have. The sociologists and psychologists tell us that there are certain basic drives inherent in the very nature of man, which must inevitably be satisfied. Jesus himself realized this. Throughout the Gospels of Jesus is pictured, throughout the Gospels, Jesus is pictured as wanting men to have physical well-being, economic security, food, clothing, and health. There are some who are so dipped and dyed in extreme spirituality that they would have us believe that Jesus placed no emphasis on these earthly needs. They are the people who are so absorbed in a future good over yonder that they are content with the present evils over here. The communists are right in calling this type of religion the opiate of the people. Far from saying that the basic necessities of life are not important, what Jesus really says is this: your heavenly Father knoweth that ye have need of all these things, but seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. He goes on to speak. Why is it that we have no peace in the world today? Is it because we have failed to? It is because we have failed to follow the principles of that gentle Prince of Peace who died on a Roman cross atop a Judean hill centuries ago. In other words, we have failed to place righteousness first. So long as we place our selfish economic gains first, we will never have peace. So long as the nations of the world are contesting to see which can be the most imperialistic, we will never have peace. So long as America places white supremacy first, we will never have peace. Indeed, the deep rumbling of discontent in our world today on the part of the masses is actually a revolt against the imperialism, economic exploitation, and colonialism that has been perpetuated by Western civilization for all these many years. All of these injustices must be eliminated if we are to have peace. When will a stupid world rise up to see that a get tough policy cannot bring peace? Universal military training cannot bring peace. The threat of the atomic bomb cannot bring peace. But only through placing love, mercy, and justice first can we have peace. And there is more. So again, I only point that out to remind us that the later king, and we understand his assassination is very much connected to the more public-facing criticisms of the U.S. government and its international desires and quests. He was a hated man, but that hatred only deepened when, after the legislative successes, it seems that he has the gall to ridicule this nation, which has done so much to grant African Americans what it is they needed, right? Or at least that's how it was seen. So certainly it makes sense that we associate this kind of thought with the later king, the king that becomes a target for having gone too far, perhaps. But we want to keep in mind this is who he was, right, from very early on, and there's no flinching involved there, right? He didn't have to arrive at this in some kind of piecemeal way. All right. I'm going to read this one in. There is irony in people who use quotes from Dr. King and then say he would have supported certain things when he expressed a disliking for them during his lifetime. I think I get what you're saying, or disliking for some of the things that people are perhaps suggesting he would have liked when in fact he would not. And I'm right there with you, and we're going to get into that a little bit as well. On the need for stark lines. So one thing, we need to be willing to draw some stark, bold lines and unequivocally name things for what they are. Being willing to draw some stark lines between ideas that might otherwise be taken as equivalents will allow us to be a little bit more clear about what King meant and about how, if we wish to embody his thoughts and ideals, the kind of conversations we need to have about the language that we use, right? And the meaning behind some of those things. Many of the ideas that you all shared earlier on certainly fit within or around or nearby what I would hold out as the key, which is white supremacy. And by drawing the stark line, we invite people to make clear choices and clear commitments. Right? To stand with King is to make a commitment to fight against and acknowledge white supremacy. We can and should do the work of evaluating how well my little neat equation really works, right? How well it sits along some of the expressions that you all, some of the ways that you articulated what King is for and against. Dr. King did not equivocate about his stance against white supremacy, and neither should we. Instead, we should take the opportunity to examine how he understood white supremacy and how he understood it was manifested in daily American, in our institutions and in our daily interactions as U.S. citizens. I want to share something from this text. So back to the reading portion of it. And again, this is from the introduction, which was written by Vincent Harding, who I mentioned was a preeminent African-American sociologist and friend of Dr. King and co-author, and whom I had the honor of sitting in a room with in a conversation on a couple of occasions, and ignorant as I was, didn't quite appreciate who he was or what he had done. Until he had passed, which is unfortunate. So, in any case, I'm gonna go to page 18. There we go. And I'll share a portion of the quote here. So, on equality. Now, this is Vincent Harding recounting a story involving Fannie Lou Hamer, who is another towering figure in the civil rights movement, who did a lot of the legwork and the groundwork to make what King ends up doing possible, right, and carrying forward much of his work. Yeah. So Harding writes, I recalled the story of her, Fannie Lou Hamer, being questioned by a reporter at the historic 1964 Democratic National Convention and asked about her powerful challenge on behalf of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to the convention's acceptance of segregated delegations. Did her vigorous anti-segregation stand mean that she, quote, was seeking equality with the white man, end quote, the reporter asked. No, Ms. Hamer firmly replied. What would I look like fighting for equality with the white man? I don't want to go down that low. I want the true democracy that'll raise me and the white man up, raise America up. Using somewhat different language, this was the message that King fervently sought to convey to his nation, his people, his children. That was the ultimate answer to the question posed by his book's title, Where Do We Go From Here? To raise America up, that's where. So part of commemorating Dr. King is to become more aware of why equality was not enough, why integration was not enough, and why seeing a time when little Black boys and Black girls would be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers was one small part, almost a trivial part in a sense, of a much greater dream, not the realization of the dream itself. So as we turn to more of his words today, I hope that we together will become clearer and share some of our clarity, given the opportunity near the end, perhaps, on what it means to go up, what is, how we can further articulate what King means by raising America up. And I'm not suggesting that King was not striving for equality, but he was aware of the limitations in this being the catch-all phrase to capture what the civil rights movement was about. And again, this takes me back to, Ken, could you pronounce the young person's name for me there, the last comment? Because I believe
Yep, it's Anadoya.
Thank you. Yeah, the idea that, you know, I'm not suggesting the king is not saying we fight for equality, but there is a limitation that he recognizes, and then a need for us to have a conversation around that limitation. I want to respond to Shay quickly. What exactly are stark lines? In this case, what I meant by that, and I'm sorry, I'm like playing on this lines metaphor. But we'll have an example in a moment, right? There are different ways that we can describe the meaning of equality. Right? And when I say stark lines, I want to suggest that King has a very clear understanding of what genuine equality actually means. And we want to put a big, bold marker around it and say, this is what it means. And if you stand with King, you'll see this meaning and you'll get it. And this is what you will stand by. And if you are more given to some other watered down version of what equality means, you've traversed the line, you've crossed the line, and you're not actually standing with King. Right? So in a sense, yeah, what I mean by stark lines is calling things what they are, right? For me, that means saying that King was fighting against white supremacy, right? That encapsulates everything else for me. And the line is, if you stand with King and you stand with me as someone who attempts to emulate King, then it's a non-negotiable, right? That's what I mean by stark lines, right? So again, certainly deliberating and talking and discussing the words and the legacy, but then choosing, making a choice and making commitment. Thank you, Shay. Thank you for asking. I appreciate it. All right. So a bit more on equality, particularly the limitations. And so I'll share a part of this quote, right? There is not even a common language when the term equality is used. And again, I'm going to go into this text, chapter 1, which is entitled Where We Are. Where are we? I apologize, it's terrible. Where are we? It is a question. Okay. Let's see. So after enumerating several of the inequalities that Dr. King understood to still exist, despite the victories of the civil rights movement, he goes on to say this about those inequalities. These brief facts disclose the magnitude of the gap between existing realities and the goal of equality. Yet, they would be less disturbing if it were not for a greater difficulty. There is not even a common language when the term equality is used. Negro and white have a fundamentally different definition. So one thing to consider is, again, the chapter is entitled Where Are We? And this is written in 1967. And to the extent that these different definitions still exist, or different levels of commitment to different definitions still exist, is very telling some 60 years later, if my math is close. Just a bit more. Negroes have proceeded from a premise that equality means what it says, and they have taken white Americans at their word when they talked of it as an objective. But most whites in America in 1967, including many persons of goodwill, he's not speaking about ardent racists, proceed from a premise that equality is a loose expression for improvement. White America is not even psychologically organized to close the gap. Essentially, it seeks only to make it less painful and less obvious, but in most respects, to retain it. Most of the abrasions between Negroes and white liberals arise from this fact. So again, to the extent, he's talking about language, he's talking about words, he's talking about what we commit to in action, given our understanding of those words. And again, to the extent that we continue to perhaps be speaking a different language, or in this case, and what we're going to look at a little bit more is have people deliberately misusing and misleading young folks, and often manipulating language to make political points to just keep older folks at ease. I'm one of them, so I can say that. That's damaging and that's dangerous. So while on the one hand, I don't want to give oxygen to ideas, some whitewash version of what equality is, or the idea that human decency, which King admits is what the civil rights movement ended up ultimately bringing about, was common human decency, right? When you put that in perspective, we don't want to, again, kind of suggest or allow others to suggest that that step towards decency was the end, right? Or at all what was intended by Dr. King and others when they embarked on the movement. Unfortunately, speaking of oxygen and gasoline, so fires to a dumpster fire. I don't know who's familiar with PragerU, but they're a thing. And I want to share with you a thing that they produced. And again, this speaks most directly to the comment earlier around ideas that people associate with King or quote him as being in defense of. Yes, you saw this. Yes, that's what I'm talking about. I want to say you saw it in my class, but I don't think that's when it happened. All right. In any case, it was painful, right? I'm sorry to put you through this, but here we go.
It's been 50 years since Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was shot to death on a motel balcony in Memphis, Tennessee. And over the decades, he has become one of the most revered figures in American history. There is an impressive memorial to him in Washington, D.C., and a museum celebrating his life in Atlanta, Georgia. Countless schools and boulevards have been named after him, and a national holiday is dedicated to his memory.
So production is important, and so far this is lovely, right? National memorials, places named after him, familiar and good, and I feel good about this because this is what should be in the world.
How is it then that so much of his legacy, what he hoped to pass on to the future, has been lost? King wanted equality under the law and said, famously, that people ought to judge one another based on character, not skin color. But he also believed that blacks had an important role to play in their own advancement. The black civil rights battles in America are now over, and King's side won. The best indication of that may be that King has had no real successor. If black Americans were still faced with legitimate threats to civil rights, such as legal discrimination or voter disenfranchisement, it's likely that leaders of King's caliber would have emerged to carry on the fight. Instead, what we have today are pretenders who have turned the civil rights movement into an industry, if not a racket. And what have these racketeers accomplished? A lot for themselves and very little for their constituents. Racial gaps in income, education, and home ownership were narrowing in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. But after King was replaced as the spokesman for Black America by the likes of Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, and others, these gaps began to widen in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. This suggests that the racial disparities that continue today aren't driven by whatever racism that still exists, despite all the claims to the contrary from progressives and their allies in the media. It also suggests that Black culture, attitudes toward marriage, education, work, and the rule of law plays a much larger role than the left wants to acknowledge. More marches won't address fatherless homes. More sit-ins won't lower Black crime rates or narrow the school achievement gap. Electing more Black politicians and appointing more Black government officials can't compensate for these cultural deficiencies either. Black mayors, congressmen, senators, police chiefs, and school superintendents have become commonplace since the 1970s. Even the election of a Black president, twice, failed to close the racial divide in many key measures. Black-white differences in poverty, home ownership, and incomes all grew wider under President Obama. Discussion of antisocial behavior in poor Black communities, let alone the possibility that it plays a significant role in racial inequality, has become another casualty of the post-60s era. King and other Black leaders at the time spoke openly about the need for more responsible behavior. After remarking on the disproportionately high inner-city crime rates, King told a Black congregation in St. Louis that we've got to do something about our moral standards. We know that there are many things wrong in the white world, he said, but there are many things wrong in the Black world too. We can't keep on blaming the white man. There are things we must do for ourselves. The pretenders to King's legacy mostly ignore this advice, preferring instead to keep the onus on whites. Where King tried to instill the importance of personal responsibility and self-determination, his counterparts today spend more time making excuses for counterproductive behavior and dismissing any criticism of it as racist. Activists who long ago abandoned King's colorblind standard, which was the basis for the landmark civil rights laws enacted in the 1960s, tell young Black Americans today that they are victims first and foremost. White society is against you, they say, even if you have no clear examples of discrimination to point to. They are told that fire hoses and poll taxes have been replaced by unconscious racism, white privilege, and microaggressions. A generation of Blacks who have more opportunity than any previous generation are being taught that America offers them little more than bigoted teachers, biased employers, and trigger-happy cops. It's not only a lie, but as King understood, it's also self-destructive. Black activists and white progressives stress racism because it serves their own interest, not because it actually improves the station of Blacks. But this neglect of the role that Blacks must themselves play in writing their own lives can only make matters worse. A half-century after King's death, plenty of people are paying him lip service. Far too few are following his example. I'm Jason Riley of the Manhattan Institute for Prager University. Thank you for watching this video. To help keep...
Oh, no, you don't. Okay. So yeah, on the one hand, don't want to give oxygen to certain things. On the other hand, the oxygen exists, right? This is YouTube. Okay, I saw a couple of comments in there. Yes, connections to classwork. This is lovely. Again, slightly painful. I'm actually just going to stick to reading my notes right here. Because as someone pointed out, it's both comical and infuriating. Right? This is the world of contradictory experience that we're kind of immersed in all the time. There are many things that jeopardize the realization of Dr. King's promise, but as an educator, I think one of the greatest perils we face is a fast eroding shared sense of the role that race continues to play in today's society. This erosion is aided by the co-optation of civil rights language and symbolism, which has been amplified in this era of mass false moral equivalence. And this is a very clunky term, but it feels right. I think it speaks to our unique technological ability to spread utter nonsense at warp speed and have a good deal of it be taken as gospel truth. There is a subtle false equivalence between authentic equality and the notion of loose improvements, right? Subtle, that we have to make stark. But there are also examples that are much more complete, thoroughgoing incidents of creating these false moral equivalents. And in this case, the falseness that is being offered to us is that advocating for, as we see in one of my textbooks, individual autonomy and freedom to participate in the system as is what the movement was about. And if you're not doing that, then you're not living up to King's legacy. So there's a level of sophistication through which this is done, and more, oh, thank you, Shay. More importantly, I do not want to ignore the fact that some of this might be appealing, right? I accomplished some of what he talked about. I've taken advantage of what King would have had me take advantage of, right? Opportunities for education and all the rest. And so I might feel good, right? And the danger is, for me or anyone else, if you grasp on to they're not slivers of truth, they're slivers of values that resonate with us. If you grasp onto that, you might very subtly fall victim to what boils down to vicious cultural racism that's communicated in that video. There's a lot wrong with that video. And again, people with a sense of history, scientifically minded people, people that have a sense of cause and effect and historical change, that might have hurt your brain. So there's any number of ways to go about dismantling that particular argument. But again, what is scary is the resonance of some of the values, right? And the reality that if you want to grab onto a couple of the pieces that he said that sound good and make you feel good and sound like they line up with what you understand of King, it's a slippery slope, right? Before you also wholeheartedly imbibe all of the cultural racism and eventually don't see systemic racism, right? Which is ultimately what they're going for. There's a couple things. For the sake of time, I'm not going to do it, but that quote that they point out and they say that where King said we have to do things for ourselves, that's not inconsistent, first of all, with fighting ferociously against white supremacy. But it's also taken out of context, right? It's stated as if it were an admonition against a group of Black people in a church in St. Louis, right? And he's telling them, hey, you got to get your stuff together, right? We make up 10% of the population of St. Louis, but we're doing 58% of the crime. What the heck is wrong with you? I will find a way to share with you the source material, but they took that quote from something that was written by James Baldwin. And I very much want to read it because reading anything out loud that James Baldwin has written will make you feel good inside. It's good for your heart, but I'm not going to do it. But in any case, Baldwin had been commissioned by Harper's Magazine in 1961 to do a profile of King. And he was describing why King is an effective orator. And he was basically saying why he's effective. It's not because he can do these things and rouse people to their feet and all the rest of that. It's because he so deeply identifies with the people that made him take leadership. He so clearly identifies with the fact that the movement that he becomes the symbol of and the leadership of, that they started that movement. And so he's commiserating with them when he's telling them, hey, there's some things we need to do better. In context, it is very clear that he's saying, this situation sucks. But I recognize your dignity because you started this movement and you deal with this sucky situation on a daily basis. And it is a struggle to not succumb to the suckiness of this, but we have to do it. He goes on to say in the same paragraph, and this is where the moral part actually comes in. He says, anytime that you allow a white person to think that you are okay with segregation, that you will succumb to what segregation forced upon you, you are cooperating in evil with those persons. So when he's talking about morality, it's not an admonishment, right? We've done so much and you're running around committing crime. He's talking about the dignity that it takes to deal with that, but the amorality of doing it because what you need to be doing is voicing that you don't agree with segregation and that you will not act in any way that suggests that you're succumbing to it, right? So he's commiserating. And again, this is very clear. I bet anything that either these folks didn't read, didn't care to read, or just blatantly and intentionally manipulated that quote to sell T-shirts. A lot of them sold. Right? So again, the cultural racism piece, of course, is the suggestion that there are just cultural deficiencies, right? There's no systemic racism. That doesn't exist. If there's anything bad happening to Black folks, it is because of these cultural deficiencies. And of course, King was admonishing Black people for having these cultural deficiencies. Did not happen that way. I probably should have just read to you the Baldwin. It would have taken the same amount of time, and Baldwin is the best. Related to that, though, quickly, there is this quote from chapter 1, and these are King's words. The hard truth is that neither Negro nor white has yet done enough to expect the dawn of a new day. While much has been done, it has been accomplished by too few and on a scale too limited for the breadth of the goal. Freedom is not won by a passive acceptance of suffering. Freedom is won by a struggle against suffering. By this measure, Negroes have not yet paid the full price for freedom, and whites have not yet faced the full cost of justice. He's talking about blacks and whites. He's talking about not equal culpability, but the fact that there's culpability on both sides, and that the moral call, in part, for African Americans, is to not to succumb to the, again, for lack of a better word, and it's not very James Baldwinian, but the suckiness of the situation, the demoralizing nature of the situation. All right. I'm sorry, I was just looking at something in the notes. All right, so again, hopefully we understand the dangers, and I did see a comment in the chat that, yeah, it is indeed dangerous, right? And what is most dangerous is the possibility that people will fall into the logic that it represents and kind of succumb to the culturally racist views there. Let's see. I'm doing terribly on time, and I apologize. I do want to get to this first clip. We can think of this as a direct response to that prior characterization of what the civil rights movement was about and what its failings were.
Swing, Civil Rights, King, Van Oker, roll 20, sound 36.
Dr. King, this church is as good a place as any to go back over your commitment to the civil rights movement. When you went out from here into university and then you went to Montgomery, Alabama and started the bus boycotts there, what was the philosophy of the civil rights movement as you saw it then, more than 10 years ago?
Well, I would say then the philosophy was that we must go all out to use legal and nonviolent methods to gain full citizenship rights for the Negro people of our country. Of course.
Sorry, folks.
That particular struggle and that philosophy centered on breaking down all of the barriers of legal segregation. So I would say that in that period, the basic thrust for the gaining of citizenship rights for Negroes was to end the humiliation surrounding the whole system of legal segregation.
Well, in the South, particularly in Alabama, you had visible villains, Jim Clark, Bull Connor, cattle prods, police dogs. But in the North, you don't have those visible villains. Isn't it hard to get your people aroused and directed at something that isn't visible?
Well, that's exactly right, and this is what I was saying when I said it's harder to see your target. In the South, in the nonviolent movement, we were aided always, on the whole, by the brutality of our opponent. It isn't the same way in the North. The other thing is that you don't have legal segregation in the North as you do in the South. So it is much more difficult to get people to see exactly what you're doing, but it isn't an impossible job. It's a hard, it's a tedious job at times to get people to be aroused from their apathetic slumbers, but I still feel that Negroes in the North can be motivated just as they were motivated in the South. And I think as time goes on with the growing economic deprivation in the Negro community, it will even be easier because people will come to see that not only is something wrong in general, but something is wrong in particular in their own economic and housing situations.
Well, what is it? I mean, how do you find it? It's very subtle in the North, is it not?
It's subtle, but it's becoming much more visible. Anybody can see that the schools are more segregated in the North today than they were in 1954 when the Supreme Court rendered its decision declaring segregation unconstitutional. Anybody can look around the ghetto and see that ghetto schools are predominantly segregated and devoid of quality. Anyone who moves through a major ghetto of our country will see gated and devoid of quality. Anyone who moves through a major ghetto of our country will see the housing conditions, and they're often rat-infested, vermin-filled slums. And it isn't too hard to see the exploitation that the Negro confronts in the ghetto, where he is forced to pay more for less and constantly trying to make ends meet, but because of either no job as a result of unemployment or a job that is so economically unprofitable that the person can't make ends meet. And I think they see all of these things, and more they're coming to see them, because before the people of the North were looking to the South and they supported the struggles of the South. Now they're coming to see that their problems are very real and they've got organized to grapple with them.
Okay. I'm going to apologize now because I've done a woeful job of managing the time. However, again, some things to try and point out in this idea of just mass fraudulent moral equivalence. So there's a clear contrast between what King describes as the goals of the civil rights movement, the victories of the civil rights movement, a very clear contrast between saying King did those things and the legislation was passed and they won and then it was over and everyone should have gone away. King, assessing his own quote unquote victories, was very clear on the fact that the fight in the North versus the South were very different. In 1967, he was struggling with these ideas. And again, that's why this book is so important. Our king, the king of our narrative, of a narrative against white supremacy, was struggling with these questions, right? But he knew that what happened in the South did not address the structural issues that he was starting to lay out in that piece and as he lays out here. In addition to laying out those structural things, admitting to and understanding the limitations of what had worked in the South, he starts to offer an analysis of what needs to be done and what could be done. Again, because we're short on time and we'll get this book out to people, there's literally an appendix, right? Andrew Yang is not the first person to talk about a guaranteed living wage, right? King talks about things in the labor and employment sector that are akin to Medicare for jobs, right? Some ideas that sound radical and out there, but we're half-heartedly pursuing half of what he talked about at that time. Again, as educators, as people in an institution of higher education, there was so much more I wanted to show you. But the point is, we have access to these things. I saw some requests for some of the information. We will get it to you. And do let this be the start of something, right? There's volumes of work. There's so little need to reinvent anything. And there's such clear direction. And much of it is concrete. It's not pie in the sky, as some people will write it off to be. Last point on that, much of what King is asking us to do, he talks about a revolution of values. And he suggests that even when we see what were referred to as riots, he called riots in Watts and Detroit and other places in the 60s, in the late 60s, that those were expressions of a need to evaluate how we do so much in the United States. Right? It's not lofty to talk about love and peace and community. Those aren't lofty things. This is a matter of knowing the truth and then acting on it. He lays out very clearly what his truth was, There's all kinds of evidence of systemic racism. He lays it out. He describes a situation that doesn't look so different from the one we're in right now. So the evidence is there. A choice is there to be made. And from there, commitments need to be made. One last piece. When I was first, the title was more, it was in reference to a video that I saw on YouTube of a police chief who had suggested in speaking about some BLM protests, that King would never have taken a highway, right? The idea being like, okay, we get you, it's all right, Black police chief. But really, is this the right way to protest? Isn't this a little bit too much? King would never have taken a highway. It doesn't take a whole lot to see how convoluted that is, right? The one thing we all know about King, which was Selma, and everyone and their uncle was there, it kind of involved walking on a highway and crossing a public bridge, right? Just the extents that we'll go to recast King, all in the name of playing down white supremacy. The violence that we saw in the Capitol last week, initially my thought was the danger that we face is just the bastardization of King's actual words and legacy. The danger we face was shown in DC last week, right? That's what happens when we continuously put off having real conversations.
Was there something hypocritical about the fact that
if we continue to put off those conversations, if we continue to indulge in language that suggests that these things don't exist, instances that attack democracy itself, like we saw last week, they'll become part and parcel of what we can look forward to expecting going forward. So again, I'm sorry. We'll get information to folks in the links. I see the request for it. Ken, turn it over to you. Very late, and thank you all again. And again, my apologies. There was much more I should have gotten to you.
Dr. Defreece, thank you so much, sir, for coming today and just educating us all on some of the language and some of the resources. I certainly am going to pick up that book as well. And I'll get out to the group. Dr. Defreece and I will work together. We'll get the list of resources that he used today. I'm looking at the video right now. I'd love to see that video. So we'll get the links to some of the presentations that we didn't get to today, so everyone has a chance to watch those and educate themselves. Dr. Defreece, what classes do you teach for students that have maybe not taken a class with you? And I want to take a class with you. What classes do you teach, sir?
I teach sociology 2530, racial and ethnic relations. I teach sociology 2510, which is intro sociology. I've taught 2570, sociology of the family.
So there's a good place to start to continue these types of conversations, this types of education is, taking some sociology class with Dr. Defreece. And I saw a lot of other sociologist professors on our chat today. So thank you all for coming. And with that, I wish you guys a great day.
Thank you all. Thank you, Ken. Thanks everybody else.